Hello and welcome to EE233. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take a look at an introduction to while loops. And we're going to look at several examples. This video is part of a larger series of videos focusing on the fundamentals of the C programming language known as our fundamentals demo. The first thing that you want to do is obtain a copy of our while loops snips file, and we can either take a screen capture of this. Either way, just go ahead and copy over your function prototype and add it to the list of functions that we will be working on. And go ahead and copy the comments as well as the start of our function implementation, and go ahead and paste it at the bottom of our fundamentals.c. So the first thing that you will note here is I've got some temporary variables. We'll talk about these as we go along. The idea is basically we're going to use these to drive different examples of our while loop. The second thing you should note here is the basic syntax for the while loop, and then some additional links that I have provided for some of the examples, as well as a basic table here. Now, please note that this function accepts no input arguments and returns no output arguments. So everything we're going to be doing is going to be inside of this function. So to begin with a while loop, essentially the only thing that you have to worry about is the loop repetition condition, which is essentially a fancy way of saying, while this is true, the loop runs, or the loop continues. So basically what happens here is while whatever condition or expression or evaluation is inside these parentheses, while that's true, or while that evaluates to true, you run a line or lines of code, and it's either a single statement or a block of code. You will see this occasionally without curly braces. I would encourage you to use the curly braces and simply treat everything as if it is a block of code or multiple statements. But essentially, as long as this expression evaluates to a Boolean, true or false, particularly while this statement evaluates to true, these lines of code will execute. Now, the key thing to note with a while loop is that you must make sure to initialize any variables that would be used in the loop repetition condition. Otherwise, some unpredictable behavior can happen. The second thing that you want to make sure to do is make sure that something about the loop repetition condition changes inside the while loop, because otherwise you'll have an infinite loop. And at that point, if we do accidentally get an infinite loop, we'll want to be able to hit Control-C in the command line to be able to escape out of it. So the two little additional notes here that we need to note is that first, we need to make sure to initialize the condition outside the loop or before the loop. And secondly, we need to make sure the condition changes at some point in the loop. Otherwise, we will have an infinite loop. And if we get a chance to, we'll go through an example, perhaps not in this video, but in a later video, of how this can happen accidentally. So to begin with, we'll come back to these links in just a second. I'm going to set up a while loop using my integer index, my temporary variable above. So as I mentioned, the first thing that you want to do is you want to initialize that condition outside the loop. So in this case, what we want to do is make sure that we are initializing our index to some value. In this case, I'm going to initialize it to 0. The idea is I want to build a while loop that will essentially allow for me to count up to a certain value, or perhaps count down to a certain value by a certain increment. And then we'll simply print out a table utilizing those values. So for this particular example, I want to initialize my index equal to 0, and this becomes my start value. This point, then, what I want to do is I simply want to specify, using the while syntax, a loop that will continue until I hit a maximum value. In this particular case, I'm going to focus on 9. So while index is less than or equal to 9, we want to run a series of statements. So run these statements. But before we even talk about what those statements are, we want to make sure and follow up on this third point, and that is we need to make sure that the condition changes at some point in the loop. Now, this particular example is pretty straightforward. We want the index to change each iteration of this while loop so that ideally, eventually, it will become greater than 9, and at that point, then the while condition will be false and we will stop running the while loop. But before we get to that, we essentially have to come up with a way to change the index value in this particular case, because it is what controls the behavior of our while loop. And to do that, we're simply going to say index equal to index plus 1. And so every iteration of this while loop simply adds 1 onto the value of the index. That's why it's very important that you initialize any values that you might be using to control your while loop outside the while loop, and then inside the while loop, they need to change. Well, let's demonstrate how this works by simply copying our table into our while loop. And what we'll do is we'll simply print out. Actually, in this case, let me take a second. I copied this to the wrong location. We don't want to copy it into our while loop. We actually want to copy it outside our while loop. And we want the while loop to be inside the borders of our table. And we want to print the values for our table using a couple of placeholders, in this case, %d for the index, and we're simply going to have a simple computation leveraging that index. So in this case, another %d followed by a new line, and for the first %d, we're simply going to specify the index, and then for the second %d, we're going to do a simple computation of 2 times the index. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take a second to go ahead and comment out this other set of print statements. And I'm going to go ahead and save this and go ahead and build it. And then let's go up to our main and add this onto the ever-growing list of arguments handled from our command line switches. So in this particular case, what we want to do is we want to add one more else if. And in this case, it's just going to be a single string compare I. We're going to look at argv square brackets 1, and we're going to see if it matches our while underscore loops underscore 01. And if it does match, what we want to do is we simply want to run our while loops demo. And then the last step, of course, is to add this to our list of switches in our documentation. So in this case, I'm just going to borrow one of the other lines in our help, make some minor changes, and just make some simple notes here about what this does. Once again, I just encourage you to keep up with this. It's not required, but it does help later on to look back and historically see what you've done, or if you give this to someone else to run, they know what the executable does. All right, so let's go ahead and build it. Once again, we're successful. We'll come out to the command line. There's our screen. We'll run our fundamentals demo with no switches. Sure enough, there's our help. And we'll run it now with our while loops _01. And you'll see that we have a nice little table. We perhaps just need to clean up a little bit by moving over the second column. But essentially what it does is it starts off at 0 and it continues to loop until it hits 9, and it takes the index value that we're incrementing by 1 and simply multiplies it by 2 for the second value in the table. So once again, just little minor details here that we want to clean up. Wrong table there. There we go. Now we're in our while loops demo here. Okay, so let's take a look now at a second example. And so what we want to do is begin with, let's go ahead and make another copy of our table. I've added a new line there at the bottom, another new line at the bottom of the first table. We're going to go ahead and make a copy of our template for our table, and we'll go ahead and uncomment this example out. And what we'd like to do here is we'd like to repeat the same process with a while loop. Once again, printing out, in this case, 10 values going from 0 to 9, but we also want to use this as a way of demonstrating another function that will be useful to us in the future. And that is our random number generator. Now, what I would encourage you to do at this point is to pause the video and take a look at a couple of the links that I provided you in the wiki books, particularly the links to the srand function, which seeds the random number generator, and the time function, which can be used to seed srand. The idea is that we can then use that seeded random number generator to create a stream of random numbers that we are going to use. So how are we going to use it? Well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to, instead of having the second value in the table simply be a multiple of our index, I would like for us to use that as an opportunity to simply print out a random number. So to do that, following our recipe for our while loop, the first thing that we want to do is outside the while loop, we want to initialize the condition. In this case, we want to initialize our index equal to 0. Inside the while loop, or inside the two bars, if you would, of our table, we once again specify what criterion or what condition we want to have for our while loop to continue running. In this case, we're going to keep the same example. We want it to continue while the index is less than or equal to 9. And third thing to remember is we always want to make sure to change the condition at some point. So in this case, I'm going to simply increment the index. Now, of course, we can do index equal to index plus 1, but for a little variety, I'm simply going to specify index plus plus. This will also increment by 1. All right, now, what we'd like to do is print out two numbers. The first number is going to be the %d that corresponds to the index. And for the second value, I want to provide then a second %d. But that second %d is going to come from our random number generator. And so for our first one is simply going to be the index. The second one then is going to be leveraging the rand function. And what, if you had a chance to look it up, you'll see that rand will produce a value from 0 up to a rand max. And the rand max then is tied to the maximum value for an integer. So in this case, then a rand should produce an integer that will then be placed into that second %d. So let's go ahead and build this example, and let's see how well our random number generator works. And so your values might be a little bit different than mine, but more importantly, if you run it a second time, you should note that you get different values each time you run this example. So our tables should look differently. Please note that you start off at 0 once again, go to 9, and essentially what we're doing is we are querying or getting 10 random numbers or 10 random integers. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take this just a step further. Oftentimes, you aren't going to be dealing exclusively with integers while you're working with while loops, but rather you might be using some sort of condition, some sort of expression, or even a flag. And so for these next two examples, what I'd like to do is leverage these additional variables that I have up here, these temporary variables. The balance variable, which represents essentially the checking or credit card balance. So we'll call this maybe your check card balance. And a purchase would be an attempt to buy something from a convenience store or maybe from the cafeteria. So an attempt to buy something. And we'll see here, there's a couple of different ways that we can go about doing this, but we can also use a flag. We'll come back to this. This is just simply a flag that represents a condition. For the first example, I'm going to use the balance and purchase variables to essentially control when my while loop stops. In the last example, I'm going to show you a modified version using that broke flag or that integer. So to begin with, as always, we want to initialize our conditions before writing our while loop. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to come up with a balance for our checking account or our credit card. In this case, we're just simply going to assign a value of 100. The other thing that we want to do is we simply want to keep track of how many times we've used the card. So we also want to initialize our count, and we could also initialize our purchase, but we're going to leave that now to our random number generator. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to once again leverage our table template here. So go ahead and make one more copy of it. And we're going to modify it ever so slightly. Go ahead and uncomment it. But basically, what we want to have here is we want to keep track of the count. In other words, how many times we've tried to purchase something or some sort of even index for that purchase. But then for the value, what I want to have here is the value of the attempted purchase as well as the resulting balance. And so the idea here is I want us to see how we can use the while loop to track the amount of money in our checking account. And the idea is that once we drop below 0, we can't purchase anything anymore. So what we'll do here is we'll set up our while loop and say while our balance is greater than 0.0, we can purchase things. And how do we represent a purchase? Well, we simply use our random number generator. And our random number generator, if you recall, will generate an integer. Now, we've specified a balance of 100, and we could use the rand function to be able to simply demonstrate this using integers, but I'd like to make this a little bit more interesting by simply dividing whatever value we get from the rand function by 100 to convert it then into dollars and cents. So what we do here is we'll say rand divided by, in this case, 100.0, and this will convert an integer dollar or an integer value to essentially dollars and cents. Now, at this point, we simply say balance is equal to balance minus our purchase. Additionally, what we'd like to do is we'd like to increment our count, and then finally print out the whole thing. So we use a printf, and for our first placeholder, we're going to specify the %d. For the second placeholder, we're going to use %.2f, and for the third placeholder, %.2f. Once again, we may have to tweak those spaces just a little bit. For the first placeholder, simply you put in the count. For the second one, you specify the purchase value, and then the third one will simply be the balance or the current balance. Now, at this point, you probably are already seeing some of the flaws in this approach. But let's go ahead and look at it anyway. So we'll go ahead and run it. And you'll see that our random number generator has specified a value that is already higher than our balance in our card. So in this case, it actually generated 11,912, which we divided by 100 to get the value, which resulted in our balance being less than 0. So we've got a couple of things that we can clean up here, not the least of which is on our table, we probably ought to move the values over just a little bit to line up with the headers. But secondly, let's go ahead and separate our second and third tables by adding a new line. And then lastly, let's address the problem of the balance. So there's a couple of ways that we can go about doing this, but since ultimately the purpose is to show you how a while loop can be used with a double, I would simply like to increase the initial balance so that way we can get a few more iterations out of our while loop. So go ahead and build it one more time. Run it one more time. And you'll see that with a larger initial balance, this runs, in this case, 57 times. It was a few more than I had expected. We can get most of them on the screen. But essentially what you see is the slow reduction in our balance until we actually have a negative balance. Now, in the quote-unquote real world, you would not be allowed to make this final purchase right here. So what we want to do is we want to revisit this problem one last way. And that is, instead of directly using the balance greater than 0 as the condition for our while loop, instead we want to use the flag. And so in this case, what we want to do is we'll still go ahead and initialize the balance equal to, in this case, 10,000. We want to initialize the count equal to 0. But then we also want to leverage this last variable, this broke variable that I created. And we're going to use this as a flag to drive our while loop. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to assign 0 as false and 1 as true. So in this particular case, essentially we start off with broke equal to false. So not broke. Now what we do is we can once again leverage our template for our table. Matter of fact, at this point, this will be the last time that we'll use it in this particular example. So let's go ahead and uncommented. And like in the previous example, we're just going to focus on the count, the value, and the balance. And in our while loop, we simply specify our condition to be while broke equal to 0, or essentially while broke is equal to false. Now, we still use our random number generator. In this case, we'll say purchase is equal to rand divided by 100. But instead of simply subtracting the purchase blindly from the balance, we are now going to check to see if the purchase exceeds our existing balance. And if it exceeds our existing balance, then we trip the flag that we are now broke, which prevents us from overdrawing our account. So in this particular case here, what we'll do is we'll say if purchase is, we'll start with less than our balance, we can buy it. Else, we do not have enough money. Well, if we do not have enough money, then we simply set broke equal to 1. If it means we can buy it, we can simply say balance is equal to balance minus the purchase. All right, so let's build this one. And we'll run this. We should get a second table. Let's go back and see what has happened here. Tell you what, let me see if we can figure out where the mistake is. So if purchase is less than the balance, we should be able to buy it. We've initialized our balance. And let's come out here. All right, so let's separate out these tables real quick. Add a new line right here. All right. And, we didn't print out one, so we forgot the most important line here. We need to print out the balance, the count, and we also need to increment the count, just like in the previous example. Now, we're premature on running our code because we were not actually printing anything out. And now when we come over here and run it, we should get a second table where we, once again, are keeping track of the purchase count, the value of the purchase, the balance after making the purchase. And now you'll see that I end my loop with a positive balance by virtue of the fact that I am using the flag as the condition to leave the while loop. Now, there's a third scenario that you might consider handling, and that would be attempting to make another purchase while you still had money. So essentially, even though you couldn't make that specific purchase, maybe you could use the rand function to generate another purchase that you could make, in which case what you would do is sort of a hybrid approach between these two examples, where you simply had the if statement inside the while loop, and you would only subtract the purchase from the balance if the purchase was less than the balance. And in this case, then you would simply continue while the balance was greater than 0. And as soon as it went under that value, then it would kick you out of the while loop. So Hopefully you found this video useful. Once again, these are 4 different ways to use a while loop. We'll be investigating many, many more in the future, including being able to use characters as the seed for a while loop. As always, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me, and thank you for watching.